again, the word itself is created to describe the government of Athens in the classical era, right? The government of Athens that evolves over time. So a little bit about how this government evolves, right? So we have Solon during the Archaic era, 594, famous, lawgiver, right? Who establishes this new written code of laws for the Athenians. One of the things that he does is he also institutes some political reforms. One of the big things is that he divides Athenian citizens into 4 categories based on wealth. So basically what your annual kind of income is, so to speak, right? So we've got the pentakosiomedimnoi, which means the 500 bushel men, Hippeis, right? Cavalry or knights, the Zugatai, yokemen, and thetes, laborers. And basically this was based on how much agricultural produce you produced on an annual basis, right? If you produced 500 bushels and more, you were in the top category. 300 to 500, you were in the knights category or the cavalry. The idea was that you had enough money, enough resources to basically have a horse and had the funds that was necessary to kind of equip, kind of a cavalryman in the Athenian army. A Zugatai, right? Again, 200 bushels, enough money to basically purchase your own armor and weapons to serve as a hoplite. And then below 200 bushels, this was everyone else, the thetes, right? So one thing that you kind of gathered here, we'll mention this tomorrow, I think, right, is that in Athens, right, you were expected to serve in the military, but you had to provide your own equipment, right? So base level, kind of the foot soldiers, you needed the armor and the weapons, right? Kind of maybe one level up, at least initially, fighting on horseback, cost even more money, right? You had to maintain the horse, you needed, all the equipment, right? So this came out of your own pocket. Okay. Now, the other reform, right, is that there would be an assembly meeting, right? We're not quite sure what it was like before Solon, but after Solon, all citizens, regardless of what wealth class you were in, were allowed to participate. And the assembly was basically when all the citizens came together to discuss matters of state and to make decisions. Now, only the top class, the 500 bushel men, were eligible to be archons. And archons, right, first there were 3, over time there's going to be 9. These are kind of the leading magistrates, right? Magistrate meaning like executive officer of the Athenian state. So only the richest people could be archons. Again, we think that the assembly elected them, but we're not quite sure. You're going to hear a lot of, well, we're not quite sure when talking about Athens because there's a lot of gaps in our knowledge. Okay. He also creates a governing council. So the word for a governing council in Athens was a boule, right? And then the governing council, which was made up of 400 citizens, right, from the top 3 wealth classes, right? So everyone but the thetes, the laborers, their job was to set the agenda for the assembly. What's the assembly going to talk about? What are we going to talk about first? Then what's next, right? So again, that comes with a degree of power. If you've ever run a meeting or say organized a class, right? Deciding what it is we're going to talk about for how long, that's not nothing, so to speak. And then there was something called the Areopagus Council. So this was named after the hill upon which it met, right? Again, we're not quite sure of the details about how it worked, but basically the job of the council was to oversee the Athenian laws. And it was made up of former archons. So after you served as an archon, which was a yearly kind of office, or an annual office, right, then you became a member of the Areopagus Council. And again, who was eligible to be an archon at this time? The rich, right, the super rich, right? So again, who's on the Areopagus Council, overseeing the laws? The super rich. Doesn't sound very democratic to me yet, right? But again, it's a start. This idea that everyone can participate, well, every citizen, right, can participate in the assembly That's a starting point. Okay, everyone good here? Yeah, good. All right. So, our next big moment comes with Cleisthenes, right? And this happens after, right? So Athens is going to be ruled under a tyrant by the name of Pisistratus and his sons. And remember, tyrant isn't necessarily a bad thing, right? In archaic Greece, right? But eventually the Athenians are going to push out the family. So no more tyrant tyranny, and they need a new constitution. And Cleisthenes is going to be the guy that puts it together. Okay? Now, again, we think of a constitution as a written document. Okay? But that is, and still, well, actually it was and still is kind of unusual, right? Prior to the United States, for example, countries didn't have written out constitutions. So what constitution meant was just kind of how the government or how the state was organized, how it worked, right? But it didn't refer to a specific document, right? It was a description of just what the government was supposed to do. So Cleisthenes doesn't come up with a new written document, but he comes up with a new way of, kind of organizing and conducting state business. Now, his main goal through all of this, and this is going to be really important, is that he wanted to break up traditional alliances and rivalries, because he saw these as being both destructive to Athens and conducive to the rise of tyranny. So the way that he does this, again, don't need to worry about details, the big picture here, is that the Athenian citizens used to be divided into these 4 big groups that weirdly, I think, has been translated into English as tribes, which doesn't quite make sense, but that's the word that people use in English, right? So there used to be 4 of them. So Cleisthenes he gets rid of those 4 and creates 10 new ones, right? So if you're an Athenian citizen, you're going to be a member of one of these new 10 tribes. The way that he kind of forms the tribes is that he divides Athens and the surrounding region that Athens controls into 3 different regions: the city, the shore, and inland. Then he basically breaks up each of these regions into trities, so that there are 10 trities in each region: 10 in the city, 10 in the shore, 10 in inland. All right, and then just another important vocabulary word: each of these trities is made up of a deme or demes. And deme, this basically means like township or maybe neighborhood, right? So has kind of this maybe kind of local identity, but it's part of this bigger state. So, where do these new tribes come from? Cleisthenes takes 1 treatise from each region and puts them together into a tribe. Okay, this might be hard to envision. So we have a map, which is also really super confusing, right? But just to kind of highlight this about how it works, right, is that each color represents one of the new tribes that Cleisthenes comes up with, right? And the circles are the city, the triangles are inland, and the squares are the coast. And then each of the names, the little names or stuff, are individual demes, right? So for example, this tribe here, okay? Let's start with this treatise here, right? That's going to be part of tribe number 4. You can see it takes this group of people, this group of people, this group of people, this group of people, and they say, okay, you are now 1 treatise, or 1/3 of a tribe, right? So you can see it's grabbing people from kind of different areas, right? And then they're going to get smushed together. I should have picked something that was a little bit easier to point to. I don't know if you can see it, like the very top there's some like dark blue triangles, right? And they're going to be the inland part from this treatise. And then over here, there's kind of like dark blue circles in the middle, right? That are all kind of jumbled up. And they're going to be the city or the urban treatise, right? For this tribe. And so these 3 treaties, which again, they're not even people that are like, they're living kind of close to each other, but not even their nearest neighbors, right, are going to be grouped together into a tribe. So what's the big picture takeaway from this? What do I want you to know, showing you and talking to you about all of this?
Well, that he broke up the tradition of 4 alliances and everything on
Right? And then how did he break them down? Or how did he kind of form the 10? What's his goal? What's he want?
We're trying to break up political alliances.
Right? And how does he break up political alliances?
Reorganize them into small sections. So
Mhm.
kind of
But
divide-
it's also about how he reorganizes them. So you're absolutely right. How does he reorganize them though? What is it?
into 3 regions.
Okay. But when he forms a new tribe, where are the people from the tribe coming from? Different areas, right? So again, this is how he is, so you're right, he's trying to break up the kind of old order to create something new, and he does this, right, by basically grabbing people from all different areas, right? This would be like the equivalent of saying, okay, we're going to create a new congressional district, right? So, and it's going to be like 3 blocks from the Bronx, you know, this neighborhood from Brooklyn, you know, a couple of, you know, kind of areas in Manhattan, and they're going to be a new unit, right? So again, people from all over the place, so trying to kind of mix it up in order to break up kind of old alliances, old groupings. So that's what he wants to do. Okay. The other thing he does is, you remember we've got this boule, this governing council. And what's the boule's job? Remember, what's the job?
Wouldn't it set like the president
For what?
for what's going to be in discussion? So
What's going to be discussed where?
like in the assembly.
In the assembly, right? So the assembly, the big meeting of all the citizens, the boule's job is to set the agenda. You know, kind of preside, to keep things running. So Cleisthenes increases it to 500 instead of 400. You're going to have 50 members selected from each of the 10 tribes to serve for a year. Then each tribe, the 50 members from that tribe, will be in charge for 1 month. There were 10 months in the Athenian year. They're called prytanes, right? And then their job again was to set the agenda and to regulate the assembly. Continuing from Solon, right, all but the Thetes are eligible to serve. Okay, questions here? Okay, so now we can see, all right, things maybe getting a little bit more democratic, right? Like in the sense that, you know, we've got these new groups, it's made up of different people from different areas, right? Trying to kind of maybe break down old power imbalances. So now we come to the classical era, right? The era that we are focusing on here in the class, right? Again, we start the classical era in 479 BCE, right after the end of the Persian Wars. And the Persian Wars are important for Athens, 2 reasons, or 2 related reasons, right? As a direct result of the Persian Wars, Athens gets like kind of powerful, even more powerful militarily, and Athens gets richer. And they're kind of related, right? So as a result of the Persian Wars, Athens is going to be kind of a preeminent Greek superpower. But with this money that's coming in, and with this power, we're going to see some changes to the Athenian state. Okay, one of the big developments that we see, at least early on, is the idea of ostracism. Right? This might have been in part of Cleisthenes' constitution, we're not sure. We see the first one in 487, right? So just before the beginning of the classical era. Okay? And again, this was, when we're talking about Aristides the Just, right? This is what was being described at the end. So the way that ostracism worked, if you were to be ostracized, this was not a penalty per se. It wasn't a punishment, technically. But you had to leave Athens for 10 years. So basically you had to leave the city and weren't allowed to come back for 10 years. So you didn't lose your property, you didn't lose your money, you could still collect your income, but you just had to go away. So how did this work? Each year in Athens, there could be one ostracism. The assembly, in an assembly meeting, right, so remember, assembly is all the Athenian citizens, there might be a vote. Shall there be an ostracism this year in 2025? Right? Everyone in the assembly votes. If the majority says yes, then there will be an ostracism in 2025. Now notice what is missing from this vote. We voted, should there be an ostracism this year, yes or no? There's something important that's missing. What's missing, Tiffany? Who should be ostracized, right? So first, there's a vote. Should there be an ostracism, yes or no, for this year? If no, okay, we're done. If yes, then there's going to be an ostracism. 2 months later, there's a second vote. Who should be ostracized, right? Everyone voted, instead of by showing, for the second vote, instead of like a show of hands, which was normal, but by writing their, I guess, proposed candidate for ostracism down on a piece of pottery, right? And these were called ostracons, which means like a scrap of pottery, which is where the word ostracism comes from. And written on these, we see some famous names. We see Pericles, son of Xanthippus, right, the famous Pericles, Cimon, son of Miltiades, again, famous Athenian, and our friend right here, Aristides, son of Lysimachus, right? So these are just ones that archaeologists have collected. So this second vote, who gets ostracized, right? Basically, whoever gets the most votes, and there's not like a slate list of candidates. It's not like, hey, you can vote for A, B, or C, right? It's like, okay, who's going to be ostracized? Go. And so you get to write down a name, right? And whoever gets the most votes, so long as at least 6,000 are cast, gets ostracized. Okay? So again, the final story that we get from Aristides the Just at the end of his source, right? What's the final story that we hear about him before he rides off into the sunset? What is it, Luis?
Didn't he ask like an old man who he voted for?
How so?
Like the old man basically said, oh, I voted for this person just because he was just called the Just.
Right.
There was no really.
So we get the explanation that some guy, he runs into some guy, and the guy's like, yeah, I didn't like Aristides just because they called him the Just, so I voted for him to be ostracized. That's my reasoning. And what else does Aristides do for this person? Let's see, Tiffany.
I think he ended up just casting a vote for himself.
Or essentially he wrote out the guy's vote for him. So right idea, right? Because the guy couldn't write. He's like, well, I want to ostracize Aristides, but I don't know how to write his name. Could you do it for me? Because the guy doesn't know that he's Aristides, right? So he's ostracizing a guy who he doesn't know, who he doesn't recognize, based on his reputation. And again, Aristides could write down anything, and the guy wouldn't know. But because he is the Just, he writes down his own name, right? And he's going to be ostracized. Okay, is there questions? All right, so what's the purpose of an ostracism then? What do you think? Why does this become so important in at least the first half of the classical era? And think about the story of Aristides, which I think can kind of help provide some hints. You don't have any ideas here, Anthony?
To prevent like influence from actually spreading.
What do you mean by influence?
So I don't know, if he committed like a crime, what if he influences someone to do that very same crime based on its nature, or some type of modification based on it?
Well, but if he committed a crime, you can exile him for committing the crime. You don't need an ostracism, right? If the guy does something wrong, exile is a really popular punishment. The whole point of ostracism is that you don't have to do anything wrong, so to speak. What do you think? Brian?
In my opinion, I think the purpose of autism was to was ban someone who might pose a threat, who might pose a potential threat, and to their way of life.
Okay, we're getting closer here, right? Someone who might be a threat, right? Jake.
But they view somebody that might be like a tyranny or something like that.
Okay, right? And how do you become a tyrant in ancient Greece? What do you need?
Popular support.
Popular support, right? So someone that's getting a little too popular, a little bit too big, people are listening to them a little too much, maybe they pose a threat to the democracy, right? So this was supposed to be the democracy in action. That if the people felt that someone was, again, destabilizing or problematic in some way that wasn't criminal, right? Because if it was criminal, there were other ways of getting rid of them. But just something that this person's a danger to the democracy because whatever, right? It was a way of basically pushing them away, right? In theory, reducing their influence so that the democracy can prosper. Right, Luis?
We also say that the fact that the assembly was comprised of all four classes, that also played a significant role.
Oh, it certainly could, right? Yeah. So again, this is something that even kind of Plutarch talks about in our reading, right? He was the author of the biography, who says, one of the reasons why he's like, well, some people think Aristides was poor, some people think that he was rich, but we know he was ostracized, and it's really only the rich, because by extension, the rich are also the archons, the political leaders, that incur the kind of jealousy and envy and hatred of the people. So the fact that Aristides did this probably means he was rich. Okay, other questions about this?
What would happen if you didn't leave for 10 years?
Don't know, really. Enforcement is always kind of tricky, right? But probably there would be some sort of repercussions. But we don't really know. Tiffany, do you have a question?
Yeah, so for ostracism, so let's say when they leave Athens, would they go to like another city-state?
They would. So they would go to some other city-state where maybe they had friends or relatives or connections, and this will be important in a second. So they can go anywhere else, they just had to go somewhere other than Athens. Other questions? Great, questions?
Once they get ostracized, what happens to the family?
Nothing.
So they just.
Well, I mean, the family might, like, if you're talking about like wife and children, would probably go with them because they weren't really citizens in their own right. Maybe adult children would probably stay, like brothers, because again, this wasn't technically a punishment, right? So it's not like you're being penalized with exile, even though technically kind of the same thing's happening, right? But the Athenians were very clear that this wasn't a punishment, despite the fact that it kind of was.
Was there like any different sort of treatment when they came back from their ostracism?
Technically, no, right? But again, as you can kind of imagine, I mean, and again, we don't really know, maybe there was, right? Maybe people would just look at them a little bit differently. Maybe people wouldn't trust them as much, or maybe they would. But technically speaking, they were just supposed to come back in 10 years, and it was like kind of stepping right back into where they left off.
If they came back, could they just do the ostracism to just get them out again?
They could. Again, who has the power in a democracy? Well, no, not, I mean, technically not here. I mean, it's not that there's equal power, but who has power in a democracy? Strict words, the people. And so the people have decided that they are better off with you gone, right? And so that's the idea behind it, is that this is something that is given to the people to kind of perpetuate their rule, right? Now it's missing something else that we associate with democracy, right? Something that we associate with democracy are things like rights, right? But that's not there in Athens, right? Democracy is about preserving the power of the people. And if you need to go for 10 years to preserve that power, the people have spoken. Okay? So it's a very different kind of understanding of democracy than we might have, talking about the word. All right. So other things are happening about this time, right? 487, again, just before the classical era, they changed the way that archons are selected. So now, instead of probably electing them, they elect a body of 40. 40. They elect a body of 40, and then out of this body of 40, they draw lots, right, to choose 9. So why do you think that make that shift from election to kind of election, but then for the final kind of vote, we're just drawing names out of a hat. What's the goal there? Gideon?
Avoid like any sort of corruption.
Okay, right, it's a way of maybe avoiding corruption. What else? So this would be the equivalent of saying, all right, we're gonna have a vote for who's gonna be senator. We're gonna vote for, 5 names. And then we're just gonna pick one at random and then they're gonna be the senator. Any other guesses about why? So avoiding corruption is a good one.
I think it might also be to establish a fair and balanced system, because if you just picking one of those 5 people that are random,
Okay.
and on the way, and then prove on the way about that, like for example, looking more favored for that position in power.
Right, that's exactly right? So there's this idea that and again, people still talk about this today, that someone who's being elected might not be the best candidate, right? Or might not be the best representative of the people. And so this is kind of a concession to this, that okay, we're going to create this body of names, but then we're just gonna kind of draw randomly, right? And this idea is that somehow this is going to be more representative of the people, right? That this is going to avoid maybe difficulties related to popularity or money that come with elections. At least a little bit, right? I mean, remember, they're still the richest Athenians, the body of 40 is still being elected, right? But there's still this concession at first to, okay, maybe we don't want that to be the end result. We're going to let kind of chance happen. But it's soon after, it's not just the richest Athenians. The second richest, right? The knights, the Hippeis, become eligible to be archons. But the office of archon is becoming less and less important because there is a new office, general. Here's the one where the Athenians are like, you know what? We really want to make sure that we are electing and choosing the right person. So every year they elect 10 generals who are going to basically be responsible for military affairs. And one will be elected from each tribe. Remember, 10 tribes, 10 generals. More than that, unlike archons, they're eligible for re-election year after year, because again, the idea is, well, you want the best guy in charge leading the troops. So because this office continues to be elected, so no choosing by lot, and because people can be elected year after year, this starts to become the most powerful office in ancient Athens. It's going to be as general, where Pericles is going to be this dominant political figure who's elected to this office year after year after year, right? So even though there's kind of a movement to kind of maybe make things more democratic, move away from elections, some things remain. And as they remain, right, these offices are going to get more powerful. All right, I already talked a little bit about life of Aristides. I think I'm just gonna kind of skip this. But if other people, just in the interest of time, but if other people have any questions about the reading about Aristides, the Just, I'd be happy to talk afterwards. So, about soon after the beginning of the classical era, like I said, money's coming in, new Athenian power. We get the emergence of what modern scholars call the radical democracy, where it's going to take these ideas about democracy like we saw in ostracism, or like we saw in selecting the archons, or the final selection of archons happening by lot, and pushing them up to 11. So 462, something happens. Something important happens. Unfortunately, we know little about the specifics. But we know it's important, because later authors tell us it was important. They just don't bother to tell us exactly why, because they assume you know, because it was so important, right? So there was a politician by the name of Ephialtes, who was able to push through some reforms. All we really know is that he is able to transfer power from the Areopagus Council So remember this elite council that was made up of former archons, usually the richest, or maybe now the richest and the second richest Athenians. And he's able to transfer that power to the boule and the assembly. Which, if you remember, everyone could participate in the assembly, and the top 3 wealth classes could participate in the boule. So again, he's taking power away from a more elite institution and giving it to what we might say a more democratic institution. What this actually looks like or what powers they are, we're not quite sure. Okay, Alexander.
I wanna ask you a question. Do you
Yes.
think that this form of democracy is unstable?
Not really. I don't think that's the worst problem with it, really. I mean, the worst problem with it is the lack of individual rights, I would say, is the big issue. But there's really no conception of individual rights. So it's the idea of kind of majority rule. So like, you know, if the class votes, hey, you're not allowed to be in class anymore, that's democracy to the Athenians, right? If the class votes, you know, hey, you know, you can't work at this job anymore. You're not allowed to be a farmer anymore. That's the will of the people, right? Modern democracy, we can see that that's a problem. So modern democracy is about balancing the will of the people with individual rights, things like free speech or right to property. Athens doesn't really have those rights. So that's one of the reasons why it's unstable. There's other reasons too. All right, anyway. Another important thing about Ephialtes is, well, 1A, that we're going to know his reforms are important because he's going to be assassinated soon afterwards. But his kind of chief right-hand man is our friend Pericles, who is going to help Ephialtes get these reforms passed. And then after Ephialtes' assassination, Pericles is going to become the leading figure, the leading political figure in Athens. All right, so what are some things happening during the radical democracy? One is they start introducing payment to participate in politics. Before this point, right, there was no payment for participating in politics. If you served as archon, you served on the boule, right, you didn't get any money. You had to rely on your own family funds, right? Starting with first the law courts, then the boule, and then eventually the assembly. If you participated in any of these parts of the government, right, you would get basically a paycheck, a day's wage, so to speak. And this goal was to increase participation. All right, so for example, an assembly meeting would take place maybe all day on a weekday. Now, if I am independently rich, I come from a wealthy family, I don't work anyway, it's really easy for me to go to the assembly, right? I mean, what else would I be doing? Sitting around drinking wine. But if I'm a farmer, right? To go to the assembly for a day, what does it mean I'm not doing? Farming, right? And what happens if I'm a farmer and I don't farm?
Can't sustain yourself.
I lose money, or maybe I even starve, right? So it's much harder for poorer people, even though they are eligible to participate, it's much harder for them to participate. So this is one of the reasons why elites are still going to dominate, at least early on. So this is an attempt to kind of rectify this by saying, okay, if you come and sit on a jury, we'll give you a day's wage to make up for what you lost for not working. Or, you know, you serve on the boule, or come to the assembly, right? So again, it's about trying to broaden the scope of which citizens are able to participate. Something else that happens, right? Archons become selected only by lot. So instead of electing a body of 40 and then choosing names out of a hat, now they're just going to choose names completely at random, right? Plus, the third highest wealth class, the Zeugatai, become eligible as well too, right? So it's expanding the eligibility of the office and then choosing who's going to be archon. You get a list of people who are interested, then you choose names out of a hat, and they're going to be the archons. Okay? So what is Athens happening here in this radical democracy? What's the goal of people like Ephialtes and Pericles? What are they trying to do? What do they want? Tiffany?
I guess like spread like power evenly, like between the people, kind of, and just have like a rich class controlling everything.
Right. So kind to maybe deconcentrate power at the hands of the rich. Now again, are the rich still gonna have an advantage? Yes, right? I mean, they're all, having money, having these resources is always going to give you an advantage, right? But they're trying to kind of spread things out a little bit more, right? The idea, again, trying to make Athens more democratic, in the sense that if it's about the people having the power, then the people as a whole should be participating. Of course, who's left out of all of this still? Mostly the thieves, right? The laborers. But they may have become eligible to serve as archons or to serve in the boule. We're not sure, maybe. But even still, right, even though the boule was paid, for example, like being an archon was still unpaid, right? So if you're a poor, kind of, again, laborer, you probably can't take the time out to serve as an archon for a year because you're going to starve, right? So there's measures to kind of incorporate more people, even the thieves, but there are still limitations. Pericles also institutes a new citizenship law. So traditionally, to be an Athenian citizen, all that mattered was if your dad was an Athenian citizen. So if your dad was an Athenian citizen, and he was married to your mom, regardless of where your mom was from, you were an Athenian citizen. Under Pericles' new law, right, both parents must be Athenians. So to be an Athenian citizen, you must be born from an Athenian citizen dad and an Athenian, put this in quotes for now, citizen mom. Okay? The goal here, once again, seems to be limiting the power of elites. Okay? So if you are a rich Athenian, and your goal is to maintain or maybe even increase your family wealth, who do you want to marry? You're a rich Athenian man, you want to maintain your wealth, you want your family to still be rich and important, who do you want to marry? What's your guess? Someone of equal status, right? You want to find someone else rich. Now, there's only kind of a small number of rich people, maybe, we'll say, use this classroom, right? If the rich keep trying to marry the rich in this classroom, it's going to start to dilute the money. You're going to want a new influx of wealth. You want new opportunities to marry someone rich and keep your family up. So where are you going to go looking for a wife? Other city-states or other classrooms or something like that, right? So this is what the elites did, right? The elites were marrying outside of Athens to connect themselves to aristocratic rich families in other city-states. And this brought them lots of advantages. Besides money, right, it was also a form of kind of maintaining diplomatic connections as well, too. If I was rich and I got ostracized, I could go live with my rich family members, or my rich, in-laws in another city-state and still be kind of a powerful, influential person there, right? So again, marrying non-Athenians was a way for rich elites to kind of maintain or even increase their status. So what we think is happening here is by saying, well, both parents have to be Athenian, right? It's again trying to limit elite power, right? This is the trend. This is the big picture that we see here, right? Trying to limit or take into account elite power, trying to mitigate it, right? And trying to spread it out throughout the populace. Okay, so the way the assembly worked, right? It met on the Pnyx Hill, which is circled in red, right? It's in Athens. Right above that's the Areopagus Hill. Over here is the Acropolis, the other famous hill, right? So it's just an area of Athens, and that's where they met. As we mentioned, the boule would set the agenda, what we're talking about in this meeting, and that the Prytanes, right, the 50 members from the tribe who were in charge for a month, they would preside over the meeting and make sure everything kind of ran smoothly. Only male citizens, only men, were able to attend. right? So women were not technically citizens in this way, could not attend the assembly. So what would happen is that an agenda item would be produced, right? We're gonna talk about this. There might be some discussion, debate. Someone might propose a law, right, to address this issue, and then the assembly would vote. The assembly would vote, and then whatever it decided, oh, that was a new law or a new decision for Athens. Okay? So it was the people exercising power in a very literal way. Should we raise taxes? Everyone gets together, there's some speakers, I stand up, I say yes, I say no, I say 2%, I say 5%. Finally, one person stands up and says, okay, I'm gonna propose a new law, everyone should be taxed at 3%. Then there might be a little bit more discussion. Then the people in charge, the Britneys, would call for a vote. All right, everyone vote. Right? They would basically kind of separate, yes or no. If it's yes, you got a new law. Okay? So there is the assembly, right? Athenian democracy in action. Any questions here? All right. All right. So, tying the democracy to law. Let's finish up with a couple points here, just to try to kind of push ourselves kind of down the track a little bit. We talk about sources of law, right? And we talk about sources in two ways. The first way is, how do we as historians know about Athenian law? What are our primary sources, so to speak, for learning about the law of Athens? The answer is, well, they're not great, right? Our main source for knowing the laws of ancient Athens are collections of law courts, collections of speeches from law courts. So speeches made either by someone who is prosecuting or someone who is defending, right? And the reason we have these speeches is because there were a bunch of kind of famous speakers who would have their speeches published kind of after the fact. And these are people that we will encounter, like Demosthenes, Aeschines, Lysias, right? They might give the speech themselves, or it might be a speech that they wrote for someone else. Okay? Now, unfortunately, we have no official reports or records from court cases that survive. So imagine this. You are trying to determine the laws of New York City and what these laws were. Right? All you have is either a defense speech or a prosecution speech, probably not both, right? Almost definitely not both, from a single trial. How accurate is that going to be for understanding the laws, you think? Or what are the problems of only having, I want to know what's the law of murder in the United States in 2025. All I have is a defense speech from a single murder case. Tiffany?
It's gonna be inaccurate because people can be manipulated.
Okay, so it'll be inaccurate. How can people manipulate?
Well, it's a speech, there's no written record, it's he said, she said.
Ah, okay. But imagine at least we have a written record. Say we have a transcript of the speech. So we've got a transcript of a defense speech from a murder case. Will this tell us about the law?
Gives us a glimpse.
Yeah, why would it give us a glimpse of this? How do we know that the speech is in the ballpark at least?
For especially for murders, it could range differently depending on the types of it, and then also that's just one certain type of crime
Right.
during that time period.
So one is that we're only getting a small glimpse. But how do we know that this speech is maybe at least somewhat accurate?
Setting or background.
What's the setting or background?
It has to do with something that connects the two, like an affiliation.
Let me rephrase this. What would happen if I went into a court case, right, pretending I was a lawyer, and then defended my client by basically saying, well, murder doesn't exist. There's no such concept here in the United States. Anyone can kill anyone they want. Like, what would probably happen? Besides my client losing, right? But would that speech be accepted in any way? Right? I mean, it would be rejected. I mean, basically, it would be rejected. Judges, all sorts of problems. Like, you can't go in and say anything you want. So we know, okay, well, if there's a defense speech, right, or prosecution speech, it's gotta, be in the ballpark, right? It's gotta be addressing the issue. It's gotta be revolving around the important things. So we know that, right? Because you can't just come in and say anything. But what else do you know about the prosecution and the defense? Even though they might be telling kind of the same basic story, what's different about that? Does a prosecutor and a defense attorney have the same goal?
Oh, no.
Okay, why not? What are their goals? I know this is really obvious, but be really obvious. What are their goals? Alexander,
One defense, another attack.
what does that mean? What does it mean vis-a-vis the law? Luis?
Starting the case.
Okay, again, what does that mean vis-a-vis the law? I am accused of murder. What is the prosecutor's goal?
Prosecutor's goal is to basically use the law to prove that he did commit murder.
Right, to establish that there is this law and my actions violated the law, right? So the law says blah, 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 blah. Professor Perry did X, Y, and Z, but it didn't violate the law. Or there might be extenuating circumstances, right? So, or no, that's the defense. Sorry. The defense person is basically saying, no, this person's actions didn't go against the law. Prosecutor, right, here's the law, here's the actions, right? This person is guilty. This person, their actions violated this law. So they both probably recognize that there's a law, generally speaking, right? But where are they going to differ? Interpretation of actions, and maybe interpretation of the law, what they talk about, what they leave out, right? Now, if you've got both sides, it's easy to see where there's kind of different here. But if you've only got one, again, if the only evidence for murder you have is one speech, right? You might not know everything. So this is what we have from each day. Okay, so I'm out of time here, so I gotta stop.